أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر ولله الحمد.
Hello everyone and welcome to Conversations about Beauty and Islamic Theology, a series where we explore the rich and diverse intersections between theology, art and mysticism. Now today it is our absolute pleasure to host Dr. Samir Mahmoud. Dr. Mahmoud is currently lecturer at the Cambridge Muslim College on the BA in Islamic Studies and the Diploma in Islamic Psychology. Recently, he was assistant professor at the Lebanese American University. He has an MA in Architectural History, Theory and Urban Design, and an MPhil in Theology and Religious Studies with a focus on comparative philosophy and aesthetics. He also completed a PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of Cambridge under the supervision of Dr. Timothy Winter. Now, today we are hoping to discuss some of the ideas that emerge in Dr. Mahmoud's fascinating work on Islamic aesthetics. Dr. Mahmoud, welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dr. Badat.
So, you wrote a really fascinating and engaging article in the theology, in the Islamic theology article in Islamic theology journal Kalam, and the article was entitled Beauty and Aesthetics in Islamic Thought, an introduction. So perhaps we can open the discussion by asking what is really meant by this term Islamic aesthetics.
Yes, so I mean that was it's quite a controversial term to be used in the Islamic context, because the word aesthetics, as you already know, is a term that's borrowed from the Greek tradition. It's a Greek term, and it was appropriated in the 18th century by a group of theoreticians and philosophers like Baumgarten in the 18th century Germany, who were trying to develop a philosophical field of investigation exclusively focused on the sensible world. And that's what aesthetics means. Aesthesis means things perceived by the senses. And the idea was that it would be a branch of philosophy with its own rigorous methodology for exploring the impact the physical world has on our senses. And that's linked, of course, to the issue of taste and eventually the issue of art in the wider field. Now, that narrow term, sensibilia, has to do with things perceived by the senses, and ultimately things perceived by the senses can be studied or categorized in terms of beauty, in terms of harmony, in terms of order, in certain kind of categories that we usually associate today with aesthetics or aesthetic investigations. But it's a problematic term because it's not a term that was used before that period, at least not in conjunction with the study of beauty. So when we talk about aesthetics today, we think beauty or we think art. Well, in the 18th century, it didn't necessarily mean that, and these are a number of meanings that eventually accrued to the term with time. The more and more the broader question of beauty in wider philosophical discussions was reduced to purely physical beauty. So when ethics gives up the notion of the good and the beautiful in its investigation of good action or beautiful action, and when philosophy or philosophical ontological investigations of the nature of reality give up the notion of the beautiful linked to truth and ontology, then the beautiful is just restricted to the sensible realm. And so ergo, it becomes exclusively associated with the sensibilia or the physical world. And we get this, if you look at the trajectory of the development of this term itself, you'll see gradual reduction in its overall scope to include just things perceived by the senses. And ultimately, things perceived by the senses can be judged as either in all sorts of different ways. One of them is beautiful or ugly, especially in the context of 18th century analytical discussions in England on the nature of aesthetics or the nature of the world and beauty and psychological qualities associated with qualities of majesty or awe. So these kind of conversations are happening in 19th century romantic thought also. And that adds another flavor, another layer of meaning to the term aesthetics. Now, when you come to the Islamic tradition, or even the medieval European tradition, you ask yourself, okay, so what's the equivalent term? Was this term actually used? And you'll find, no, it wasn't used. So the specific technical term was not used. However, the correlata, if you will, or the concepts and notions and ideas we often associate with aesthetics were understood and studied. So, for example, when you think of aesthetics, you think of order, proportion, harmony, color, light. You think of all these things that you associate usually with art and beauty. Now, each one of these terms was studied and has its equivalent in Arabic and medieval Latin, but they were never grouped together as a specific field of investigation related to the senses as aesthetics was. So if a scholar faced with this particular type of conundrum, i.e. appropriating a term that's a product of a unique cultural, philosophical experience that is uniquely European, what did we do with this term if we translate it? If you look at the 19th century Arab Nahda thinkers, if you will, the Arab Nahda period, many of them decided to translate this term into Arabic. And it's till this day, it's referred to as Ilm al-Jamal, the science of beauty. And it's anachronistic because it's appropriating a term, translating it into Arabic, and then opening up a new field of investigation. And then what the scholars ended up doing is then looking back retrospectively. What are all the terms that are covered by Ilm al-Jamal, this modern discipline, and then developing this new field of investigation under this term. However, if you ask yourself the following question, and which is, I think, the more scholarly and objective question, how is it that the medieval period or medieval scholars and thinkers actually discuss these particular issues? How do they understand beauty? How do they understand awe and majesty? How do they understand proportion and harmony? In what context did they discuss it? Were they lumped together or not? These are more interesting questions because this way we avoid imposing a certain framework on the past, and rather try to attempt to understand the medieval tradition on its own terms. So people, and you get people, scholars in the European tradition like Umberto Eco and others, raising questions like, it is important to understand these terms within the context of the medieval aesthetic sensibility, as opposed to imposing it from the 18th century Enlightenment period backward. However, I've retained the term for a number of reasons, because one strategy is to say, okay, we've translated this term, it's been around for 100 years, it's familiar enough, however restricted it may be. One strategy would be to abandon it altogether, as some authors have suggested, and say it's an illegitimate, unauthentic term. It's an imposition on our cultural framework and tradition. Let's try to recover more traditional categories, if you will. That's a bit problematic because whether we like it or not, we've had 100 years of modernity and we are modern subjects immersed in this modern epistemological world. The other strategy would be to acknowledge that the term has very serious limitations, as I have done, and to say, okay, the term is being used quite widely. It's very familiar enough. It's been around for 100 years. Let's see how we can rehabilitate it, renovate it, expand its horizon from within. So let's keep the term and see how we can make it roomier, as it were, for other categories and other understanding. And I think the advantage that approach has is it engages with the, let's say, the modern world and in its limitations, but then trying to expand its horizon from within. There's an analogy here to what thinkers are doing in other fields of Islamic studies, for example, where either we reject the Western notion of reason altogether, or we say, let's engage with the modern notion of reason and try to expand its scope to such an extent that it begins to cover a terrain that's similar to the notion of aql in traditional sources. Yeah, so it's a different strategy. I would call it a strategy of engagement, and that's why I've chosen to use it. And I've tried as much as possible in the footnotes to caution or raise the awareness in the reader that it has serious limitations, but these are the parameters of the investigation. And this is how I want to use it and expand it. And so, so that's how I did it, at least in the article, and that's how I've been trying to approach it. And I think one of the advantages of also adopting the term aesthetics or Islamic aesthetics is, for someone who's been in the field for many, many years, I always felt constrained by the very narrow confines of Islamic art and architecture as it developed as a discipline in Western academia. So it was very materialistically oriented in the sense that it was centered on material culture, and anything that pertains to intellectual realm or spiritual realm, or anything that has to do with any non-material reading or understanding of art and architecture was frowned upon. And there are a number of reasons for this. We don't have to get into that. The number of reasons for why and how Islamic art and architecture eventually established itself as a credible discipline in Western academia. But what that meant was it placed upon itself very serious epistemological limits. In the past 10, 20 years, there's been a growing field in other disciplines outside of Islamic art and architecture, in the area of aesthetics, in the area of visual culture, that takes into account aspects or dimensions to material culture that are often neglected by a purely materialistic or object-oriented approach. And so I found inspiration in these more expansive, more interdisciplinary field of visual culture and aesthetics, and thought to myself, one way of breaking through the limits of these very object-oriented approach would be to adopt a framework that's already gaining legitimacy within Western academia, visual culture and aesthetics, and where you are able to explore investigations and issues and questions that go beyond material culture. And so that way you can bridge a lot of the literature that has been produced in the 20th century. Because if you look at a lot of the scholarship, you're already probably familiar, there's the hard-nosed, concrete, positivist material culture approach. And then you've got this large body of literature on Islamic art and spirituality that seems to be floating around in a nebulous epistemological realm where it doesn't have much credibility in the academic context, but it seems to speak some truth that modern academia is refusing to acknowledge or recognize. Visual culture and aesthetics allows us to bridge this gap. And what I found quite encouraging is if you look at the study of Roman art and architecture, for example, or late antique culture, there's a lot you can say about the spiritual, philosophical, aesthetic sensibilities of late antique culture that goes beyond a materialistic reading of the art and architecture through this framework. But why isn't it happening within the area of Islamic art and architecture? I think it's because there are self-imposed parameters within the discipline itself. And this is one way of expanding that scope.
Thank you so much.
To try to keep it as short as possible. I don't want to go on to other tangents related to, because there's a lot of issues involved in the growth of the discipline. But alhamdulillah, we're in a place, I think, in the field of study where we're moving beyond that now.
Well, perhaps you can kind of talk us through what that would look like in terms of, say, for example, we've got this, these aesthetic ideas emerged that we've managed to identify in mysticism or theological texts. And then we have the emergence of certain forms of art and architecture. So how would we kind of use this framework to bridge the gap between the two? What would that look like? Perhaps with an example or something.
Well, for example, one way in which visual culture and, let's say, aesthetics can help broaden our horizon and understanding of Islamic art and architecture is it provides a more expansive horizon for understanding the relationship between the way in which people understood and experienced beauty on the one hand, and the way in which they produced and crafted and produced objects of beauty on the other. So, for example, one of the big problems in the field of Islamic material culture is we know that, let's say, during the Abbasid period, a certain monument was constructed, or the Dome of the Rock was constructed during the Umayyad period. We have no clue, perhaps, as to what the people who built it were thinking, how they understood beauty, how they understood any of the categories that we associate with aesthetics. But so Islamic art historians and archaeologists focus on describing the building, when it was built, who built it, let's say, or who commissioned it, which Umayyad Caliph commissioned it, and all when they say that's all we can really truly know for certain, because we don't know anything else about. Now, one way of getting around that is to say, well, let's try to understand how material objects are actually produced within a wider culture. They're not produced in isolation. They're often produced within a certain kind of social cultural frame and a certain sensibility. So aesthetics explores this broader sensibility. How a sensibility is determined and formed, what constitutes an individual or social understanding of beauty or experience of beauty, or standards of beauty, or and architectural excellence, for example. So when we broaden the scope in this way, you can begin to explore, okay, hang on a minute. So if we're looking at the broader cultural understanding or sensibility, we can know to a certain extent a lot more about this. And knowing the way in which societies unfold and are structured, art and architecture is produced within this context. So it's produced within this kind of aesthetic sensibility. So, for example, let me give you just a very simple example. Within, and this is the big question that's often asked about, what is Islamic about Islamic art and whatnot. We can, for example, from Morocco to China, from the Volga region to sub-Saharan Africa, any traveler throughout the Islamic world will tell you that there is a certain kind of unity or coherence to this material culture called Islamic art and architecture. And there's also a bewildering diversity with it. Now, what unites all these people together is the religion of Islam, right? So one can safely conclude that, and of course, one can safely conclude within the Buddhist context and the Christian context, that the overwhelming dominance of Islam as a worldview, as a way of life in this largely diverse geographical area, had to have some kind of impact, at least in forming or molding aesthetic sensibilities. And if that is the unifying factor across this largely diverse area, then there are certain elements within Islam, as it were, that informed, perhaps not directly, but informed the wider aesthetic sensibility, which somehow then found its way or was manifest in the production of particular object of material culture. So for one of them, for example, is the overwhelming emphasis, let's say, on, or it's an iconic tendency, let's say. An iconic tendency, meaning not that images were never used, they were used in a variety of different kinds of contexts, but overwhelmingly you'll see, especially in the context of objects of worship, Islamic art is largely aniconic. It avoids the image. And we know enough about Islam's attitude towards the image and to understand that why this is the case. So in this way, one can understand the broader aesthetic or philosophical or cultural attitude towards images that is diffuse and suffuses these wide and large cultural spaces, and ultimately, inevitably, does impact or influence the production of these objects, especially in places of worship. Now, the question then becomes, well, can we establish a concrete, direct link between aesthetic sensibilities and monuments? And this is where the debate is still going on, because we still don't know enough. A lot of Islamic tradition is in manuscript form. There's a lot we don't know. And the more we uncover, the more we realize that there are, perhaps to a certain extent, more concrete links. For example, Gulu Nechipoglu has uncovered from the 14th century onwards, there are quite concrete links between intellectual discussions of the nature of geometry, for example, among certain scholars within an artistic context and workshops, and the production of certain specific buildings. Right? She's given a lot of evidence about that. So if that's the case from the 14th century onwards, it's quite likely that it was a similar case in earlier periods. Um, Now, having said that, though, one can still safely say, one can still safely explore these aesthetic questions and cultural sensibilities without specifically saying that there is a direct concrete link between this and a specific building. I think this is where a lot of art historians have a problem. And I think it's a problem that's valid up to a point, but I think their resistance to any exploration of aesthetic questions beyond material culture is too limiting and not objectively acceptable or viable. For example, in my own work, I've looked at a variety of different authors, and I've discovered something quite interesting that I think is, without essentializing Islam itself, I think is at the core of what Islam is, and at the core of why geometry was so prevalent, or why certain forms and patterns were so prevalent across a wide geographical area. And it has to do with something at the very core of what Islam actually is. Now, I've yet to, let's say, list all the textual evidence for it, but I've come across it as in such a wide variety of different sources to make the safe claim that indeed one can make this claim. And it's something that's briefly mentioned by Oliver Lehman as a hypothetical question in one of his books. He says, he's talking about an iconic aspect of Islam, and can we essentialize and discover a certain essence of Islam, or why it was inclined towards the use of geometric forms and patterns. And he says, he goes on and says, no, we can't really, unless, he says, and this is the interesting thing, he raises this question, but then never really explores it. He says, unless Islam sees itself as so universal as a religion that it could only embrace forms that transcended particular cultures. Now, any reading, especially now, let's assume, if we take that statement, which I think is very, very accurate and a brilliant insight, but I think he never really explored it for far enough. If I take, for example, one particular author like Ibn Arabi in the Islamic tradition, one can provide a very strong case for this statement from the Akbarian tradition, at least in the way in which he understands the nature of Islam and its universal dispensation. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this field and this area, and it's still emerging. My hope and the reason why I've explored these questions within this paradigm is because it opens up this space to ask these questions. We don't know really where it's headed, and I don't think we can determine beforehand the conclusions. But at least the questions are now being asked, and there's now, I think, a journal and a large research project in Europe called Visual Culture and Aesthetics in Islam, or something like that, which is something you wouldn't have heard of 30 years ago. And so this is one line of thinking that I'm taking, and I'm specifically looking at the genealogy of the Islamic understanding of the image, as surah, which is absolutely crucial, and that's linked to a particular understanding of the imagination in Islam, particularly in Ibn Arabi, and that opens up a whole different set of aesthetic questions that I think, in my opinion, explains so much about the nature of Islamic art. But that's still a work in progress.
I really want to return to this, your research on the image, but just before that, with regards to recreating some kind of aesthetic sensibility, what do you think Islamic theology has to offer in that regard?
Well, you need to, the scholarly work needs to be done first. So in my article, I explore a variety of different methodologies. Without a clear anthology of texts and books and references that have been explored, we can't really come to a lot of conclusions. So, for example, let's go back to the question of aesthetics. Assuming aesthetics involves categories like beauty, proportion, harmony, light, all these kind of categories that we usually associate with aesthetics. How are these discussed within the Islamic tradition? Well, there are a number of ways of looking at it. Either you say, explore a specific school of thought, say, okay, I'm going to look at the theological tradition, the Kalam tradition, and see how certain questions related to beauty, harmony, order have been discussed. And you usually find that you will find consistent arguments about the divine names, about the distinction between the divine names of beauty, divine names of majesty. You'll see a Neoplatonic discussion among the philosophers, for example, on sensible beauty, intelligible beauty. You'll find among the Sufis, for example, a discussion on divine love, the human form, image, and imagination. So if you look at distinct traditions within Islam, and I know it's not really, you can't really distinguish between them, because sometimes the same figure would fall within different schools. But within Islamic studies, for example, where one can distinguish between the Kalam tradition, the Falsafa tradition, and, for example, the Tazkiyat and Nafs tradition. One way of doing it is to explore these variety of these different terms and how they were discussed within certain schools of thought. That's one way of doing it. You end up with several volumes of books that look at that question. Another way is to say, okay, I'm going to look at this question within the writings of a particular author, Ibn Arabi, Ghazali, whatever it is. Or I'm going to look at it, I'm going to take a theme, let's say beauty, and I'm going to look at how that particular notion, or light, for example, let's take the example of light, and how that has been discussed from the Quran all the way to, the 19th century. And that way you weave together various different traditions. There are various ways of doing it. The point is, the scholarly work to uncover all this material has yet to be done. Vilches, for example, in his wonderful book, establishes the fact that there is such a thing as a distinct Islamic aesthetics, or aesthetics with a plural, that there are aesthetic sensibilities, and he explores a variety of different possibilities in his book. But a lot more work needs to be done. So that's the groundwork has yet to be done in that sense. I've always tried to adopt a variety of these different approaches in my own work. In some of my work, I've tried to look at the theological schools. And by the way, I mean, we talked about theology, we talked about tasawwuf, we talked about falsafa, but also you can also look at these questions and how they were discussed in optics, for example. And here you look at Ibn Haytham and the work of Nader al-Bizri and Sabra on this, or you look at alchemy, or also how one thing becomes or assumes the form of another, or you look at it within the context of. I know a scholar in Lebanon who's yet to publish a book on Maliki fiqh discussions of art in Morocco and Al-Andalus, for example. There's also ample fiqh discussions on these issues. Right? That's a whole area that has yet to be explored and discussed, for example. So the groundwork hasn't been done, Dr. Badat.
I just wanted to, just before going on to that, Ibn Arabi, and the idea of like a fiqh of Islamic art and architecture is really a fascinating thing for me, because I know in the Ottoman period, it was such a big thing. Which mosque can you pray in? How should the craftsman, what ritual should the craftsman undergo before he or her begins a particular work of art? These are questions that we find in the sources, but they haven't necessarily been collated. But one thing I wanted to ask you was this idea of beauty, and whether we see a conceptual divide between beauty as it's formulated in theological and mystical texts, and the beauty as it's used in, let's say, pre-modern art historical writing. Because one of the questions that came up during these discussions is, in all the discussions, all the kind of mystical discussions, theological discussions of beauty, the prime example that people usually give in those texts, like Ibn Arabi, for example, or Al-Iraqi, is always the human form, right? Or nature, but typically the human form. Whereas when you look at the pre-modern art historical writing, they're praising buildings for being the most beautiful thing on earth and a reflection of God's glory. But very rarely do you see a kind of pre-modern mystic saying, oh, this is as beautiful as this particular building in my context. So one of the questions that we were asking is, why is this the case? And whether this means that they're both like, let's say the human form and a building are actually participating in different forms of beauty, or whether it's the same thing, but they're in some kind of great chain of being and buildings are on a lower chain in the hierarchy.
Well, I mean, interesting you put it that way. I mean, there are a number of ways of looking at it. I would have been inclined to say even though there are different types of beauty, there's definitely a hierarchy of objects that can manifest beauty in its perfect form. So, and I think one of the things that we find uncomfortable about, and I know a lot of art historians find uncomfortable about, let's say, this discussion, is it upsets their preconceived understandings of beauty, because now aesthetics expands the notion of beauty, order, and harmony beyond art and architecture into areas of investigation that are beyond their scope. And this is why I said earlier, it's important to do this work, because now we need to expand the notion of aesthetics beyond art and architecture and include the natural world and include ethics. You know, there's a whole discourse on the gaze, for example, in the Islamic tradition. Nazar. You can look at it from the optical perspective of Ibn al-Haytham or Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah's notion of the relationship between nazar and hawa and passion, and how the nazar can be a source or a snare. The beauty of the physical world can ensnare you and then draw you into a trap, or it can elevate you and move you upwards. So that brings in the realm of ethics, because once you bring in the human being into the picture, you bring in another dimension to beauty. That expands this notion of aesthetics now. So it's becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, more expansive. Yes, the human being is the site of the greatest work of art. Let's put it that way. Crafting yourself is the greatest artistic and most creative act you can perform. And within the range of, if the human being is the ultimate manifestation potentially of beauty, because beauty is manifest most perfectly in the human being, but in the perfect human being, right? Not every human being. So it is the case that a beautiful building can be more beautiful than a pernicious, malicious individual, right? Beauty is most manifest in its perfect form in a being that most resembles the divine form, and that's the human being. And so no entity in creation can even come any close to that. And among the range of creative activities the human being can engage in, Salat is the most supreme and most creative, and let's say the most artistic and most aesthetic, if you will, if you want to use those terms. Now that upsets our contemporary understanding of aesthetics, because it means that the creative artist sitting there somewhere in some studio in Soho, who's misunderstood by society, is no longer the most creative individual now. And that person now has to expand the range of possible actions and incorporate a range of ethical virtues within the scope of what it means to be creative, and that's very upsetting. It upsets the paradigm. So that's where exploring the text on their own terms helps us in the modern world recover a dimension to beauty. You know, if you go back to the Platonic notion of the true, the good, and the beautiful, ethics, epistemology, ethics, and let's say aesthetic beauty are all intertwined and interconnected. Or if you look at the nature of the divine names, they're all intertwined and also connected. And so once we do that, it's a very beautiful notion to discover that I am my own greatest work of art. And it's no wonder then that for Plato, a cobbler was more important than a painter. We can begin to understand now how the ancients understood these things, and where the beauty of a building figures in this hierarchy of beautiful things. Now, having said that, though, I think the ultimate effect of the beauty of a building is linked to something even more profound than just investigations that artists or aesthetics usually investigate. The fact that a building encloses space, that spatial dimension, which is an irreducible ontological category, an a priori category for any meaningful thing to be, is one of the reasons why architecture is so powerful. So yet there is an inconsistency between the way in which architecture is taught and this irreducible category that is so central to our being. So if we can recover that link also, it empowers architecture and reestablishes its significance and importance as a field of investigation. I think one of the reasons why earlier authors didn't really investigate architecture much, or art, although they did to a certain extent, is because the built environment was produced with such it was produced according to let us say a traditional normative way, that it formed a natural background or backdrop to their activities that didn't require theorizing and conscious reflection. It's only in our modern age, when we've done away and destroyed the fabric of the built environment, that it's become a huge theoretical issue for us to theorize, because we want to try to restore. So a lot of things that in the past were not discussed quite explicitly, including aesthetic issues, it does not necessarily mean that they weren't somehow implicitly understood. They just weren't always explicitly theorized about and articulated. And this is, I think, one of the challenges today. If you look at, for example, the growth of our understanding of how traditional cities and towns were built, you won't find a treatise discussing many of these things. There was an implicit, let's say, tacit body of knowledge or craft that was partly embodied knowledge and partially theorized. I wouldn't say fully theorized. That was embedded in a culture of building that did not need books. Today, because we've broken away from that and there were no longer any practitioners of these arts, we need to theorize. We need to produce detailed books and theories about it in order to try to recover something that was part and parcel of the culture. And the same applies to many of the other things, other categories of aesthetics. It was unthinkable, for example, before the modern age, to think that the world was not ordered and harmonious. Today it's I mean, outside of a certain scientific framework, it's no longer intelligible, especially in wider cultural postmodern circles. It's not something that we take for granted anymore, and so we need to theorize about it so much in order to reintroduce it. So there are a number of challenges facing the study of Islamic aesthetics that have to do with the nature of the time and age that we live in, and the difficulty of unearthing the material we want in the past itself.
I'm glad you brought up this the kind of contemporary context, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, to what extent do you think some of these theological or mystical ideas about beauty have a relevance for contemporary practitioners of art and architecture? But since you made that second point, I guess I also want to ask you, to what extent do you think traditional craftsmen and people still working in the traditional manner can help us to reflect backwards on some of these ideas, because they are necessarily assimilated into this great genealogy of knowledge, which is not theorized, but nevertheless they might hold perspectives that might enlighten or open new channels of understanding about these kind of interesting relationships between aesthetics and Islam and the production of art and architecture.
Look, that's a very tough question, because I mean, the traditional craftsmen today, if and where they do exist, carry an immense treasure of knowledge, which they may not always be aware of, and yet the problem is they're not self-reflective or self-conscious enough to be posing and asking the kind of questions that have to do with how do we build an intellectual paradigm that restores these crafts themselves. And so I think what needs to happen is a reverse Bauhaus kind of thing, where you need an academy and a group of practitioners, let's say architects today, or architect builders, or architect builders, thinkers, who can, within the broader project of restoring traditional crafts and arts, embed the practice of the traditional craftsman within that, to get the most out of this. So what I'm talking about is let's say a holistic academy, but not an academy that's really a university department, an academy where actually real construction and real building is actually happening. And I'm familiar with a number of people, for example, who do work in the Arab world, traditional architecture, who adopt that model. So they take commission for large projects, and then they fly in the artists from Morocco, from Turkey, and they spend 4, 5, 6 months on the project together, working under the let's say the leadership or the guidance of the architect, within this kind of, let's say, academy. Now, a lot of the people who intern within these project academy contexts or sites end up saying that they've learned more than they have in 4 years at university. Right? So it's like it is like the reason why I brought up the Bauhaus is because the Bauhaus tried to revive a lot of the traditional curriculum, but with a very modern content, so they adopted the art and craft ideas from the 19th century, the guild idea. They tried to incorporate some spirituality. They tried to incorporate some traditional understandings of color and color theory, and even to a certain extent, meditational practices, especially in this early period, in the hope that they could produce a new type of modern. What you need is that kind of academy, and there have been several attempts to do this, to bring that traditional architect, traditional craftsman, with that commission, that project commission, and produce an academy. They haven't yet succeeded so far, but that's absolutely essential, and absolutely necessary, because the traditional craftsmen carry much more than they think they carry, a lot of valuable knowledge.
Would you say that the whole like Hassan Fathi school and Abdul Wahid al-Wakil, that's part of that tradition in the Arab?
I think that there's definitely that aspect of I mean that's one example of a the story of Hassan Fathi is quite interesting, because here he is discovering through his engagement with craftsmen, recovering the principle of traditional, because all of these architects were trained as modernists. And later discovered the value of traditional architecture, and trying to revive single-handedly, outside the context of a silsila or master-disciple relationship. They're trying to recover this knowledge. Now, Hassan Fathi had a disciple, Abdul Wahid al-Wakil, and he had 1 or 2 students, for example. So that there's a kind of element of continuity there, but it's not enough. It never produced the sufficient number of students or the momentum to bring in a different way of doing things, and that has to do with something completely unrelated, and that has to do with the wider political cultural climate of the Arab world at the time that's still prevailing today, which is deeply anti-traditional in many ways. Right, so that's another issue which we don't we're not going to get into right now, but that really meant that so many of the commissions that were coming were modernist commissions, and even at the expense of the traditional fabric of many cities. I remember reading something by the French colonial head officer in Beirut, watching the Lebanese governor of Beirut demolish the old town because he wanted to produce a midtown that looked like Paris. And so all Beirut is gone. And he was shocked, he was horrified. He was like, I can't believe these people are destroying their own city. But then it has to do with a particular relationship between the avant-garde at the time and the leading political classes, which were highly liberal, pro-Western, and their own view of their own tradition, which they saw as an obstacle to progress. So we're kind of coming out of that to a certain extent, but it may be too late.
Dr. Mahmoud, just to go back to something you were talking about earlier, which is the idea of the image in the writing of Ibn Arabi, could you, before we let you go, could you please so open that up a little bit?
Well, one of the amazing things about Ibn Arabi's understanding of Islam is, first of all, for him, Islam is characterized by what he calls shumuliyya, comprehensiveness. And that's unique to Islam because it's unique to the Muhammadan message, because only Muhammad ﷺ was sent as a messenger to all humanity. So what distinguishes a message sent to all humanity from a message sent to a particular people, like Christianity, for example? At least from the Islamic perspective, Christianity doesn't fill the bill, doesn't fit the bill of a universal religion. And by universality here, I mean not necessarily something that can be potentially embraced by everyone. In that sense, anything is universal. Shamanistic cultures are universal, or Buddhism is universal. Islam is truly universal in a number of ways. First, it's the first self-conscious message that it is a universal. But second, more importantly, it's a message that claims to be rooted in the fitrah, which is a universal substratum of human nature. So the fundamental tenets of Islamic belief, the unity of God, is so intuitively, fitraically true that it's rooted in our common humanity and in our essence as human beings, as opposed to the notion like a trinity, which is a very culturally specific understanding of somehow God coming to earth, was being resurrected 3 days later. There's nothing intuitive about it at all. So there's no fitraic element to it. So Islam is really a self-conscious universal dispensation. And that means that it has to be all-encompassing. And what does that mean? It's a very crucial, very important aspect of Islam that very few have commented on, except Ibn Arabi. If Islam is universal, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent prophets to all humanity, then Islam has to be all-comprehensive. And he uses a term, he associates the divine name, al-Muhit, all-encompassing, with the message of Islam in the sense. It encompasses without eliminating that intrinsic differences of things. Now, that means that for Ibn Arabi, that whereas it was possible to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to a certain extent, while it was possible or legitimate within a certain relative truth to worship Allah within a specific image in a previous culture that was particular to that cultural frame, within Islam, the only modality that's acceptable is one in which no specific image of God is privileged over any other. Right? That's the only way Islam can be all-comprehensive in its understanding of the divine forms. And Ibn Arabi says whereas in previous cultures it may have been legitimate within a certain, let's say, relative truth to worship God in a specific form or in a specific icon, however idolatrous that may be potentially, it had a certain relative element of truth to it, he says. But the problem with the sensible world, the physical image, is it's reifying. And so it's difficult to then dissociate the image of God from that particular concrete image. The only way Islam achieves this remarkable balance between tashbih and tanzih, i.e. giving God a form, but then eliminating that form and undoing it at the same time, is he calls in the realm of imagination. That is why Muslims are only allowed to worship Allah in the realm of khayal, because the realm of khayal establishes the as if, worship God as if you see him. And that allows for the perpetual tashbih and tanzih of Allah, or the perpetual contemplation of Allah in an infinity of different forms. Because once you do a form in your imagination, once you have a notion or a concept or idea of God, it's quickly undone. Because the imagination is fluid enough to capture the perpetual fluctuations and tajalliyat of Allah in various forms. And so Islam is the religion that is able to embrace all the infinite forms of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's only possible at the level of imagination, not at the level of the sensible image. And so paradoxically, Islam valorizes every image of God in the imagination, but restricts all images of God in the physical world, not because it doesn't recognize its possible, potential, limited truth or value as a support for contemplation, but because it claims to be the all-comprehensive al-muhit, the all-encompassing. And if it is the final all-encompassing, all-comprehensive message, it has to live up to that mandate, and that is only within khayal. That's why Ibn Arabi says, and he goes on to say, the Muhammadan mystic is the only one who's able to embrace the form of God in every religion. when he says "Asbaha qalbi qabilan li kulli suratin," etc., the whole verse where he said poetry where my heart has become capable of every form, he only characterized this as associated with the Muhammadan mystic because of the all-encompassing, all-comprehensive nature of the modality of ibadah that the Muslim embraces, and that is the one within the realm of khayal. That is the deep reason why Islam is aniconic. It's aniconic at the physical plane, not the imaginative plane, not the realm of khayal. And so that's a deep philosophical reason why the image is absent, the physical image is absent from Islamic art. Not because these poor Arabs didn't have a tradition of producing images. They did. They had 360 gods in the Haram before Islam. Not because Islam banned the image and therefore all they could do was release their creative activity and energy into the proliferation of geometric and vegetal forms. But no, for Ibn Arabi, it's because of the specific, unique mandate. And so that therefore one raises the question. There's this unique, particular philosophical, epistemological, metaphysical reason or understanding of the image in Islam that leads to a culture or an aesthetic culture that privileges forms, geometric forms and vegetal forms that are universal in themselves. And we can go on and elaborate a little bit more about this, because Ibn Arabi does talk about artists and craftsmen, and he does talk about, and he gives artists and craftsmen much more of a creative power than I've seen in any other author. It's quite remarkable the amount of creative authority and power he gives to them. But so this is one way. So if one were to ask yourself, okay, aesthetics, visual culture, looking at the specific school of Ibn Arabi, one can really come up with a very, very elaborate theory, an Akbarian aesthetics that explains why Islam ultimately produced the kind of material culture that it did, and in the way it did so.
I think that's it's very exciting for me anyway. I think that, I've got two questions related to that. So firstly, do you think that forms a response to that sentence in the Lehman book that you were talking about, right? The idea of Islam being all-encompassing is kind of an answer to that. And secondly, this idea of tashbih and tanzih, do you think that's a great way to understand why you have these things like geometry and arabesque and kind of these repeated tile patterns which kind of have this friction, right, between something which is represented and something which is non-representational at the same time?
Yeah. Look, I think because of, look, again, you can't really establish any direct concrete link, but what you can do is establish that Islam, let's say, set a certain kind of mood or a certain aesthetic sensibility. It privileged a certain aesthetic sensibility, and that encouraged certain tendencies over others, right? So that's just and that's enough to really explain an aesthetic sensibility. And so geometry, forms, even if you look at art history, travel across cultural boundaries. So if you do let's say a study of forms in culture, forms that are more culturally specific to forms that are the least culturally specific, right? You'll find that an image of Jesus or the Buddha is very culture specific. Geometry is the least culture specific. One could say that geometry is rooted in a universal order or a layer of universality that visually resembles, in my opinion, a fitraic dimension. Yeah, when you see Muslim authors and scholars in Kalam and Tasawwuf constantly talking about the universal, common human aspect of our dimension of as human beings, and then you see in the artistic realm a propensity to focus on universal forms, it can't be a coincidence, right? One medieval scholar talked about mental habits. He said, he was trying to establish a link between scholasticism and Gothic cathedral by saying there are diffuse kind of mental habits that cut across a certain culture, but manifest differently in different contexts. So in the intellectual context, it manifests in the form of scholasticism in medieval Europe. In the artistic context, it manifests in terms of Gothic architecture. So mental habits or mental frames of mind or habitus or a common aesthetic sensibility or sensibilities are diffused across groups of people, and they affect different aspects of culture in different ways. So this is I mean, one way of looking at it. Now, you find, and this partly explains why, and this is what I think what a lot of people don't understand about the nature of Islam. The way in which it incorporated so easily and so self-consciously, right? It's one thing to be influenced by another culture. It's another to self-consciously borrow quite happily. Islam quite happily borrowed from the very early on to the very late period, quite happily borrowed elements from around the world and found no problem with that whatsoever, which suggests that there's an intrinsic propensity within Islam to see itself as not entirely new, but a reiteration of a primordial message. That's all it is, really. In that sense, you cannot have a religion that's more universal than this. Its claim to novelty is that it's not new. Yeah? It's just a final, pure reiteration of it, let's say. I think its novelty is in its universality, in the sense that it's the first to say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his divine wisdom, human history is entering into a point of universal global cultural civilization. The dispensation of Islam is the dispensation for this particular epoch of human history, right? That's its uniqueness. But in its substance, it's really reiterating something that has usually been articulated within narrow cultural frames before. A qawm, a people, a nation, a tribe, here and there. So that aspect, I think, has yet to be teased out properly. I think it's a very interesting research avenue that links certain schools of thought in Islamic theology with certain trends in philosophy, in certain kind of orientations in Tazkiyat and Nafs tradition, Sufi tradition, and you'll find that it's a common underlying theme throughout Islamic civilization. And you'll find, I mean, if you want to go to another level of politics, you find the same tendency to build a frame of mind that embraces, within the Ottoman period, for example. In my opinion, you can't understand the Ottoman period properly without understanding the link between the link between the early Ottoman inclination towards Maturidi Kalam and Ibn Arabi as being a patron saint. What they have in common is something very interesting, right? And Ottomans usually saw themselves as, whether you take Osman's vision and dream at face value or not, as embracing, right? And so that's okay. So what does that mean? That embracing nature has serious consequential implications for every aspect of it. And in the artistic realm, in my opinion, this is my own argument, in the artistic realm, it means this aniconism at the level of a sensible image and embracing universal forms at the level of geometric patterns and vegetal patterns.
I think that's a fantastic, such an engaging and insightful idea. And I mean, speaking of the Ottomans, I guess it helps to explain, not necessarily explain, but perhaps helps us to understand why the Hagia Sophia, for example, is refracted in Sultanic architecture right from the very beginning, post-conquest, or even pre-conquest, but especially post-conquest. And there doesn't seem to be any contradiction in that,
No. I mean, one could really put it in one sentence that, in many ways, Islam sees the manifestation of God and certain aspects of human culture everywhere as instances of itself. It's its own moments before its final appearance. If you look at especially the tradition that talks about Prophet Muhammad as pre-existing before Adam, and then all the prophets coming from the receiving their, let's say, dispensation from reality, and then Muhammad appearing finally in human history as a continuity of this trans-cultural, universal, let's say, arc from before historical manifestation to the end of historical manifestation, let's say, then you understand all this in a very different light, very different light. However, imperfect, I think, some of the historical, political, social, cultural instantiations of it have been. However imperfect they have been. I think there's something there that can be salvaged, despite the awkward way in sometimes in which it's manifest in history.
Dr. Mahmoud, I feel like I can talk to you for hours about this particular subject, because I think your work really cuts through to the heart of what this project kind of seeks to subject to inquiry. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your patience. And I hope that this will be the first of many conversations to come about this topic.
Thank you, inshallah. I look forward to more collaboration and the publications, inshallah.